Now, the idea of terrorizing civilians through violence in order to achieve political goals was not invented on 9/11. Indeed, from plane hijackings in the 1970s to Oklahoma City bombing to an attack on the World Trade Center less than a decade before 9/11, in fact, in 1994, terror was an ongoing reality in American life. But the sheer scale of the attack of 2001 changed the way the West faced the prospect of such a threat. In the days following the attacks, then-President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, which took the United States and allied forces to Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course beyond. And that war continues from Libya to Pakistan and in the skies now filled with unmanned aerial vehicles. So since 9/11, major attacks in Europe and the United States have seemed to increase. Terror, in fact, is something that we all know and even expect in the modern world. Let's take a look first at this report by I-24 News defense correspondent Anna Ehrenheim about the world and the fight against terror in our day and age. Break it down right after.
The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the day was just beginning. September 11th, 2001. And then they were the deadliest attacks on U.S. soil, breaking an American sense of security and impregnability. Almost 3,000 were killed when al-Qaeda hijackers slammed commercial planes into New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon, while another plane crashed into a Pennsylvania field after passengers intervened. The fires at Ground Zero burned for 90 days, but the world was changed forever. The war on terror had begun.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Terrorism barely registered among Americans' top worries in early September 2001. But now, with the rising threat posed by various terror groups, 40% of Americans believe that the threat of another strike on the U.S. is higher than it was 15 years ago, the highest percentage since the attacks. 9/11 was a catalyst for two major American military interventions across the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, conflicts which have killed thousands. The war in Iraq eventually spawned a terror group considered too extreme, even for al-Qaeda, the Islamic State. The Islamic State has its roots in the group known as al-Qaeda in Iraq. After changing its name and becoming embroiled in the Syrian conflict, the group was eventually disavowed by al-Qaeda. It was the first and only time that al-Qaeda ever publicly disaffiliated itself with an affiliated faction. There has been open hostility between IS and al-Qaeda ever since, though both remain focused on attacking the West, and in the past 2 years have killed hundreds in attacks across the globe. In the years since 9/11, the tentacles of terrorism have stretched far beyond the core group of terrorists responsible for those attacks. Today, jihadist ideology inspires attacks by both individuals and groups on both minor and major scales. So to this day, the war on terror continues as governments struggle with the new challenges they face in a world where technology has become a key recruiter and executor.
Join me in studio, I-24 News senior defense correspondent Shai Ben Ari. Good morning to you. And Dr. Shaul Shai, the Director of Research for the Institute of Policy and Strategy, pardon me, at the Disciplinary Center in Herzliya. But Shai Ben Ari, I'm going to start with you. The war on terror, a term that I think if you were born 10 years ago, I mean, seems part and parcel of one's life. So the entire world. We know it as journalists. It was basically coined right after 9/11, but it hasn't really succeeded, has it?
Yeah, associated, of course, with President Bush, the second, of course. It's difficult for me to avoid the conclusion that that war on terror has not really achieved its goals to date. I would say that's even an understatement. When you ask the question, are more people today under the threat of terrorism than were actually under that same threat on 9/11, I think it's hard to avoid the answer that more are indeed under that kind of threat. When you talk about Africa, when you talk about the situation here in the Middle East, Europe definitely, even in the United States, which Bush often spoke of being protected during his term, you see the incidents in San Bernardino, in Orlando, and you see that that country also is not immune. Yes, it is probably harder to carry out something as massive as 9/11 today, but does that really matter? When you talk about the threat not really needing to be planes flying into buildings, what you really need is a person with a motive, a weapon, and maybe a soft target. That's enough to do a lot of damage, maybe not 3,000 dead, but certainly dozens, and I think that is enough to really create that actual threat of terrorism in the sense of fear. And I think that exists on a greater scale today than it did back 15 years ago.
Strategy-wise, Dr. Shalsha, I think one of the things, we're looking at a world post 9/11 where every single airport that you walk in is highly fortified, not that it seems to help in places like Belgium, for example, sadly, as we saw this year. But strategy-wise, terror never strikes the same way twice, does it? Is that something that we in the West do not understand? And when it comes to the war on terror, that is really, as Shaiban just said, spiraling out of control, so it seems, in this day and age, what could the West have done? What should it do?
I think that one of the main problems that the West has to deal with is the problem that, first of all, it's an ideology, a real one that influence young Muslims all around the world. So it's not just a war against terror organizations like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State as an organization. It's, if I will translate it to Huntington terms, it's a clash among civilizations. This is the problem. And this is one of the reasons that, as my colleague mentioned before, that 15 years after 9/11, the war is far from being over.
And not just far from being over, but Shaiban and I discussed this outside the studio, that 15 years on, there's a new terror group, so to speak, ISIS, that makes Al-Qaeda look like the United Nations. That it's so far more, prolific in its violence and attacks, and of course gunning now for a different, well, at this point in time, to Europe, so it's the time to be joined via Skype from Berlin, Germany, by Joel Shalik, news editor at Euractiv.com. And Joel, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to what was said in studio right now, but the war on terror in Europe, because let's bring it to this day and age, the war on terror in Europe seems to be failing miserably, correct me if I'm wrong, in the last year, hasn't it?
Yes, but I really strongly disagree on the persistence of the clash of civilization thesis. I can understand the appeal to arguments like that to explain the violence that we've been experiencing in Europe this summer and since 9/11. However, I would caution everyone to look at events in the Middle East, look at the fact that the Middle East and Europe are neighbors and that we have a large Muslim population that predates the refugee crisis, and understand that it was inevitable that there would be a crossover in terms of conflicts, and that the Muslim and to a certain degree the Arab community in Europe would get radicalized by the conflict.
And radicalized as a conflict, and Joel, if you can stay with us, because it's a valid point, and I'm actually both of you the same thing. When it comes to apropos clash of civilization, how do you fight an ideology other than invade a country?
I think the West does not have that answer. It has never been able to counter the ideology of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in general. I don't think that they realized that was the major issue. It hasn't been able to put together any sort of counter message, and some of its actions, I would say, have probably exacerbated the problem and helped or facilitated the spread of ideology. There has been a misunderstanding or not enough of an attempt to preempt Islamic State's embrace of the media as a tool which has really enabled their recruitment and their inspirational capabilities, which are perhaps a major problem, because they will probably be defeated on the battleground. I would even say in the near future. They're under heavy pressure at the moment in Iraq and Syria and Libya.
But that doesn't kill their ideology.
Right. I'm not sure that'll be enough to actually erase the ideology. It'll probably
rather
put them,
do the flip side.
They might funnel all of their energy towards the other you could say channel, which is already being used, of course, of using inspirationists, you can call it, or people who were unofficial sympathizers carrying out attacks in the U.S. and in Europe. All of the energy may be funneled that way eventually. We'll have to see if the U.S. or the West in general has some sort of answer to that. Not yet, I would say.
And Dr. Chan, I want to ask you, because apropos strategies, when it came to 9/11, failed communications, failed intelligence was definitely part and parcel of what happened. It's not like there was no information coming out of the Middle East. Do you think that intelligence services around the world are cooperating enough in this day and age to try and prevent the next attack?
It's never enough, but I have no doubt that it's much better today than before 9/11. I think that not only in the United States, but in Europe and Russia, China, almost everywhere, the leaders and decision makers are aware to the challenge of the radical Islamic terrorism, and because it's a global phenomenon it's necessary to create this level of cooperation. Without international cooperation, a single state cannot deal with the challenge.
And it's mind-boggling to me that that has not been actually understood 15 years on, because that was actually the problem with the security services in the United States, no cooperation. Joel Shalit joining us from Europe, though. Apropos that same question, do you think that is understood in Europe, apropos intelligence cooperation between countries, especially in this day and age of Brexit exits and whatnot?
I think that European security cooperation tends to mirror the state of the European Union in particular itself, which is that it's fragmented. And so one will see, for example, the fact that the Germans are much better at managing foreign terrorism in Germany and foreign-inspired terrorism in Germany than the French or the Belgians are. Does that mean that there ought to be better cooperation in Europe across national boundaries between intelligence services? Yes, but the big European debate, and one of the criticisms that's continually leveled at the Europeans, is that they don't take enough risks, for example, with civil rights legislation and privacy legislation to make that crucial difference. I think the Germans, again, have done a better job with that than the French and the Belgians. I think the French and the Belgians tend to be a little right. more sloppy. But I think that the difference in Europe, again, is that the Europeans spend more time trying to observe their own laws and align their security practices with their laws, and it's never going to be perfect. And I think that with right. a region this size, it's to be expected. To be expected,
and sadly, when we look at the last several months and year, practice makes perfect, and let's hope that does not continue. I want to thank you all for joining me on this part of the show.
Thank you so much. No problem.
I was on my way to play rugby after class at the International School of Geneva in Switzerland when word started to spread around campus that there'd been some sort of attack on the World Trade Center. By the time the team had gathered, I think there was a real sense that whatever was happening in New York was serious enough that we needed to get home, and a lot of us did get home round about the time the second plane flew into the second tower.